welcome this morning. I appreciate the fact that you're here. I realized with the introduction from Becca that actually this is probably the final York Circle for the decade. So glad we squeezed it in, because yes, 2020 is looming. And I see several familiar faces, and I used to get the retirement statements with me that said your 2023 date, and I'm going now, that date is looking very large in the mirror, and get you thinking about things like mattering. So I just wanted to acknowledge the support that is provided to us. Canada Research Chairs Program we've already heard about, York's Faculty of Health, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and with some of the research, the Movember Fund, so it's perfectly the last day of November to acknowledge the Movember Fund, and I'll talk about that. So why focus on mattering? Because most of my research actually is focused on perfectionism, and I had quite a choice to make, but I realized that mattering is something that is relevant to everyone at some level. So, and when you have it, it has enormous benefits for students and their families, for staff, for communities, and indeed for you. Each and every one of you can benefit from having a high level of mattering. Some more reasons why. This is a concept that I find in terms of all the psychological concepts I've talked with people over the years, including various community partners, it resonates more with people than just about anything that I've seen. And surprisingly, this is not reflected in terms of the amount of research that you can find on mattering in the psychology literature. You can probably find 100 papers on self-esteem for every one paper you find on mattering. So part of my mission is to make people in the research community much more aware of this and start to find out much more about this concept. Today we're going to talk about what we have found mostly in our lab and a few other labs. It is really a key to understanding someone. If somebody said, what do you want to know if you're trying to get a handle on somebody? I want to know if they're an optimist or a pessimist. I'd want to know how they feel about control. Do they need too much of it? Do they feel that they're being controlled by others? And I would certainly want to know self-esteem, but I would want to know whether they have a sense of mattering to other people or not mattering to other people. I'm going to show you as the third reason is that there's a great knowledge mobilization, knowledge exchange potential. And one of the reasons why I picked this topic is to show you how research can be rolled out and actually be brought into the community in terms of some meaningful applications, which my greatest frustration is to see so much research that's done that never seems to make it out there in terms of making people's lives better, and mattering has enormous potential for making people's lives better. And also it's a concept that's modifiable. It's something that you can increase and work on, find some ways to do it, and I'll talk about ways to promote mattering in others. And as I said, along with the resonance is that it's an incredibly powerful concept. It really gets people essentially where they live. And why is it so powerful? Well, it's about yourself and your identity, how you see yourself in relation to other people. It's about relationships. If you have a great deal of mattering, it's going to make relationships. A loss of mattering in a relationship, sadly, is going to break a relationship. It satisfies one of the core needs. The top three needs that people talk about, and I've given talks, I remember one time for my dad's community when he had just retired, the top three needs that people have consistently, according to researchers in this area, are a need to have a sense of autonomy and self-direction, self-determination, a need for competence, feeling a sense of competence, and a need to connect with others. Mattering actually satisfies all three, but especially the need to connect with other people. If you're somebody who feels you matter, you are very interconnected with others. And the main theorist who I'll be talking about in a moment, Rosenberg, he talked about this as vitally important in terms of resilience for life transitions. And he was focusing on the transitions that youth have, but you can also talk about transitions throughout the life cycle. Anything that's change is looked at with some excitement and trepidation at the same time. But if you have a sense of mattering to others, you've got some interpersonal resilience that will help you get through even the transition to university, for example. So the goals for today, going to try and enhance understanding of mattering, both my understanding and yours, paint you a portrait of people who feel like they matter versus those who don't. Also talk about some alarming data with children, young people, adolescents, and local surveys that I've done with school boards that point to problems in terms of how many feel like they don't matter. and then describe some ways to promote mattering and perhaps recruit you in our mattering mission. We'll all be missionaries because you can spread the word and you can make this a much more salient factor wherever you go. Now here's the creator, Morris Rosenberg, MANNY, to his friends. And this is the only picture I could find of him after scouring for hours. And as I got older, I appreciated blurry images where you can't really see, where the hairstyles started to look very similar. I get a sense that this guy was famous, he's a sociologist, but was probably very low-key in terms of taking credit, which is the way you should be. It's about the work and it's about the applications, it's not about the person. So he created the mattering construct in 1981 and talked about it in a couple of places, and then essentially sadly passed away in 1992. So he never really circled back to get into the mattering field the way that he intended to. It was first described in a paper that he had with McCullough in 81, and essentially he's talking about what we call relational mattering, which is the sense of mattering in terms of how you interact with other people. Before him, Fromm talked about something known as societal mattering, which is, do you feel like you matter in society? And whatever I'm saying today focuses on relational mattering, but if you have the sense that you're from a marginalized group where you don't feel that you matter in society, and then you don't have relational mattering, it's essentially the double whammy that will amplify the negative impact of feeling if you don't matter. So when he talked about this, he talked about essentially what you would think, feeling important, feeling significant to others. And a key distinction by a researcher named Prilatensky is that this should include being valued by others, that's a key element of it, but also feeling that you have value and you can provide value to others, so you can spread the mattering around. And one quote from this paper is, he said, the person low on mattering feels irrelevant, unimportant, or peripheral in the mind of others. And that sounds like a very bleak way to live one's life. Now, he talked about 4 components of mattering. First one is attention. You command the interest of others, feeling noticed and heard, versus the flip side, not noticed and not heard. And I don't know if you can read the cartoon. There's Lucy and Charlie Brown. She says, so what do you think? What difference does it make? You never listen anyway. Well, I was just making conversation. You know, when you make conversation, you have to listen too. You do? People who feel like they don't matter feel that people aren't listening to them. They talk over them. They interrupt them. And when you hear about a theme of giving youth voice, for instance, that really is saying giving them a sense that they matter because you're actually paying attention to them and hearing them and treating them seriously. So the first component's attention. Second, related to that, is importance. Someone cares about you. Someone makes you feel important, makes you feel special, so you'll feel valued or cherished and wanted, versus insignificant and not having those characteristics. And one thing I found, I hear all these stories of, you sadly Google, as I've been known to do. My wife Kathy's here, a York alumnus, and she goes, really? Why is it always so negative with you? Because I'll sit there and I'll do things like, let's Google no one cares and see what comes up. It's not happy. And of course, sometimes with those people, to show you that there's a perceptual element to this, they say no one cares, and then somebody, a therapist perhaps, says, but look, your daughter cares, your son cares, but they've got this sort of cognitive filter that leads them to feel that way. Very important concept that Rosenberg talked about is dependence, the idea that you can have a sense of mattering because others have come to depend on you, rely on you, so that you have a role, a niche. And this is one thing I will say, you know, if you want to get a higher sense of your own mattering, find the role for you that matters, where people come to depend on you and you can make a difference. This could be in a mentor role, this could be in a caregiver role, where you get that sense of you really are making an immediate difference and emotionally impacting someone in a positive way. And a fourth one is appreciation, and this is relevant to the caregiver context. Feeling that people are grateful and appreciate you in their lives versus you're not appreciated. And this came up from interviews with caregivers who said, you know, what is mattering to me? When somebody expresses appreciation and acknowledges all that I've done, and we know that many people as they get older with family members are going to be cast in a caregiver role. And hopefully they get a true sense of significance through that role to help combat the stress that caregivers are under when they have enormous challenges that are facing them. Here's the best example I can find of somebody who got that sense of appreciation. Mr. Holland and Mr. Holland's opus, Richard Dreyfuss. If you ever want to cheer yourself up but also make yourself cry, just play that last scene where they've gathered all of his former students. And remember the story, Mr. Holland felt that, why am I doing this? I wanted to do a symphony and be famous, and not realizing the impact that he was having on young people's lives, including the woman who became the governor. And at the end, the last scene where she's there, comes in with pomp and circumstance and says to him, Mr. Holland, we are your symphony. It'll get you every time. It's starting to get me now. It shows that, wouldn't it be great if everybody, when they're retiring or forced out like he was due to music cuts, would have a room full of people who say, thanks, you made a difference. Now, what mattering is not, I'm going to try to illustrate this with people and not have too much on research and variables today, but it's important to realize it's not to be equated with meaning in life or purpose in life. There's certainly overlapping, but we're talking about that relational element here, where you're making a difference and feel that you're appreciated by people. It's not just a sense of belonging. A lot of people say, oh, well, you could have this if you belong. And I say, well, you can be in a group of people and feel like you're invisible within a group of people. So you don't necessarily have a voice. So there's a key and important difference between belonging and mattering. If you tend to have one, you tend to have the other, but some don't, and I'll talk a bit about that. And it's certainly not equated with self-esteem, best illustrated by the idea that there was a backlash in terms of raising young people's self-esteem. Are we creating little narcissists and a legion of them? Nobody I've ever heard say it's bad to increase somebody's sense of mattering in an authentic way. So that's just one illustration that they are not the same. And empirically, there's plenty of illustrations that they are not the same. Now, just to tell you a little bit about where I'm going with the rest of the talk, children and adolescents who feel like they don't matter, we've shown have a higher likelihood of having an insecure attachment style, so they're anxious and not having that sense of bond that you need with a secure attachment. Some of them, which shows the overlap between my areas, feel that they don't matter, so this is why they feel they have to be perfect. And they have this idea that if I'm perfect, then I will matter to others. And my colleague, Paul Hewitt, who's at UBC, has a private practice where he does virtually nothing but, besides teaching and research, seeing people who are perfectionists, including some elite athletes who had this idea, well, if I am perfect, I will now matter to the people in my life who I don't matter enough to. And he said, unfortunately, the most distressed people he sees are the ones who actually attain perfection, get the gold, and then they don't get the interpersonal payoff because people are people and you can't control how other people react to you. But striving for perfection is sometimes underpinned by that need to matter. And sadly, in extreme cases, you can feel that you don't matter so much because you had a history of neglect, physical neglect, emotional neglect. And an illustration of this from my other favorite movie, The Breakfast Club, which probably is meeting right about now, if they're still doing that. The Breakfast Club, I realized the Ali Sheedy character, the basket case, when it was asked, why are you actually here? She said, if it's bad at home, what do your parents do? And her answer was, they ignore me. And she went to the Breakfast Club voluntarily, it turned out, for this all-day Saturday detention because she had nobody paying attention and no place to go, which is pretty bleak in terms of how that would turn out if it didn't get changed and improved. Now, you can give yourself the version of the mattering scale that Rosenberg developed if you want. You don't have to shout out your answers or anything, but here are the 5 very basic items that tap into this. I'll just go through a few of them. How important are you to others? And you would rate that in terms of from 1 to 5. How much do other people pay attention to you? How much would you be missed if you went away? That's a really key element of this, I think. How interested are others in what you have to say? And how much do other people depend on you? So you get 1 to 5 ratings of each of those, and the higher your score, the better you are in terms of your levels of perceived mattering. And scores tend to be skewed, meaning that most people, are going with 3s or 4s, but the lower you go, it tends to have negative consequences, as we'll see. Now, in terms of the power of mattering, to make this in the person context, one of the reasons I study this, as I indicated, is because of its link with resilience. And we know from a large literature that one caring adult can have an enormous impact on changing a person's life. And I have a quote from Emmy Werner, who's a well-known resilience researcher who conducted this like 30-year study in Hawaii. And one of the things that she said in terms of the power of this, looking at some people with some very disadvantaged starts to life, she said, the most optimistic thing we've seen in our study is that even under adverse circumstances, change is possible if the older child or adolescent encounters new experiences with people who give meaning to his life. That's what she said. I would have said his or hers. And who tell him that he matters. So she's saying out of all the factors, and they measured years of factors, this is the thing that she came back to in terms of the most optimistic thing. And we see kind of many examples of this. Some people you'll know, but tonight there's another chance to get a dose of what mattering's about. When they rebroadcast It's a Wonderful Life, another favorite movie, so I got 3 for 3 there. If you know the story, just about everybody does, but if you don't, tonight's a chance on CTV. Jimmy Stewart gets shown what his life would be like if he wasn't around, as he sees that it impacts just about everybody. And it gets to the point, he says, stop with Clarence the angel, stop showing, I can't see any more of this. Because he too had lost sight of just how much importance and significance he had in other people's lives. And I'm convinced that that story wrapped around the mattering construct is one of the reasons, besides Jimmy Stewart and his amazing performance, is why it touches so many people. Now, if you look at what happened in the movie, if you're familiar with it, it showed what happened to his home life, it showed what happened to the work, and it showed what happened to the community as the community became very dark and taken over. And this is a key thing about mattering. Not only can we measure it the way we have, but we can measure it in specific domains as well. So you can be measuring it, and people have measured it in terms of mattering at home, to mother, father, or to friends, mattering at work, and there's a literature that's starting to emerge on that. Again, there's only like 7 or 8 papers so far. And most importantly, mattering in the community. And I'll be talking about as well, the other main domain is mattering at school, whether you're talking about elementary or high school or university students' sense of mattering. And I recently published a paper with 2 other York graduates, by the way, a graduate student and a postdoctoral student, about how mattering can be brought into the university life to a much greater degree than it is to make a superb difference in people's lives. So here's somebody you ought to know, Oprah Winfrey, who has apparently got something going back and forth with Kid Rock in the news right now, where he said some bad things about Oprah. How dare him? Anyway, Oprah, to show you the importance of the caring adult who makes you feel like you matter. If you know Oprah's background, she was abused in many ways as a young child, neglected, and she owes the entire Oprah Winfrey enterprise to her 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Duncan, who she said this was the first person who ever made her feel like she mattered. And how did she do that? She made her into the classroom helper, where she gave her a role, that sense of being depended on, gave her a sense of importance. And this is Mrs. Duncan and Oprah the first time, and she brought her back on her penultimate show, when second last show, said, I need to thank Mrs. Duncan one more time for the role that she played in my life. Here's a quote from Oprah, who clearly knows what mattering is. The yearning to feel heard, needed, and important is so strong in all of us that we seek that validation in whatever form we can get it. And Rosenberg, I'll talk just a little bit in advance of the coming slide, said that sometimes, unfortunately, youth turn to some not so desirable ways to get a sense of mattering when they don't have a positive outlet. So we need to provide as many positive outlets as we can. Here's another example, Al Pacino, another famous actor. You can tell I like movies. I said you can insert your favorite Al Pacino line right here and memorize it, and I'm not going to do the ones that I can, but my wife Kathy and I were very fortunate to see Al Pacino at TIFF about 6 years ago, where he came to talk about his life. And right towards the end of the night, he talked about essentially mattering and told the story, 6 years ago now, 2013, told the story of his teacher, Blanche Rothstein. And Blanche Rothstein saw something in him and decided that she was going to nurture him, so she made him like the classroom performer, where he was given passages to read, to practice. And then one day, and what was most special to Al Pacino, was that Blanche Rothstein set out on a mission, there's that mission theme again, to find his mother and grandmother, to tell them that if they supported and encouraged him, that one day he would be a famous actor. So she had figured it out. So he told us the story at TIFF where he says, here's my teacher, he said, and he described her as, she's no spring chicken. And she's climbing up the steps in this rough part of New York on this mission, he said 7 stories high, to talk to his grandmother and mother and deliver that message. And he said that when he was not feeling good about himself, struggling as an actor, and thinking that maybe he's going to do something with drugs or to himself, the image of Blanche Rothstein climbing those stairs stopped him from doing those things. And in terms of the need for encouragement and appreciation, he says, the first time ever I had encouragement, the world where we came from, encouragement just wasn't there. We weren't seen, we weren't regarded. Do you ever think once in my life my mother or any adult would ever say, how was school today? Never. It was unheard of. And that's a very easy way for parents, just ask, how's it going? And when they're adolescents, they say, I don't want to tell you. Say, well, let it be said that I was interested in finding out. And this notion that parents don't matter to adolescents is the farthest thing from the truth that I can think of. You can read the full interview in the New Yorker in September 2014 and see the account there as well. Of course, another example, which resulted in another movie, The Blind Side, the story of Michael Orr, who was taken in by the TUOHY family. Here's a picture of Michael Orr, went on to become an NFL player and a leading advocate for youth development. And there's Leanne TUOHY. Doesn't look at all like the actress. I think she should have played herself, but didn't work out that way. And here's one thing that he said in terms of the impact of being taken in, because at the time he was actually homeless, wandering the streets, had lived in a house, I think, where mother had addiction problems and there was no father around. So he said, moving in with the TUOHYs was the thing that made it all come true. They treated me like a member of the family. I wasn't just a special project to them. I was a kid who wanted to feel loved and supported and to know that my dreams and my future were just as important as anyone's else. And there it is, the importance thing. There's a separate quote when he's talking to kids, and Michael Orr says, never forget that you matter. That's the most important thing. So you don't have to tell him about it. Now, sadly, the flip side that I've alluded to of not mattering is the sense of being marginalized. And really, we get to a point where, as powerful as this variable is, it's powerful in both directions. When you feel like you matter, you're incredibly protected, at least what the initial research shows. But if you feel like you don't matter, and then if you internalize that, so you say you don't matter to yourself, then you're in very bad shape. And we focus on anti-mattering and mattering. This came up one time when I got challenged by a school board supervisor who thought maybe the project was wasting valuable class time. And I had to give a talk, and I had like 10 minutes left. I know that they had the same feeling about the mattering construct. One group of principals said it was the most important construct out of 14 they were asked to pick from in terms of what it meant to the school and to the people in it. And I was talking, and I said, the only thing that would be worse than having a low score on those 5 items that I read out to you would be if you had this feeling that people were in their lives and were going out of their way to make you feel like you don't matter. And they didn't hear it, but a bell went off in my head, and I went, sometimes asking about the negative is not simply the absence of the positive. So we've created this other scale called the anti-mattering measure, and here's some items here. So how much do you feel like you don't matter? How often have you been treated in a way that makes you feel like you are insignificant? And to what extent have you been made to feel like you're invisible? And there are 2 other items. So when we assess this now, typically we give the 5 items you saw previously, as well as the 5 from this other scale, and we show that they're negatively correlated, but they're not the same thing, that the negatively toned ones pick up on many negative outcomes beyond what Rosenberg was measuring. Now, the person who talked about marginalization and a sense of not mattering is an educator named Nancy Schlossberg. I have a hard time saying it as I get old, Strasberg. And she was talking about building a sense of community by addressing when people were feeling marginalized and replacing with a feeling of mattering. And interestingly, her particular focus was adult learners at universities. How they can feel like, does the university make them feel welcome? Does the university make them feel like they're special, or do they feel like they're really stigmatized? And I'm aware of this because I also in my past spent 4 years as the undergraduate director in psychology, where I'd be talking to the people who are coming back to university after a long time away. And it was very important for them to get a sense of that they had a niche and that somebody was recognizing their particular issues. But she also talked about, and has a book you can find about mattering and other factors for retirees, and the idea that key to retirement in terms of a positive is developing a sense of mattering versus you retire perhaps even from a high status position and now feel like you no longer matter. And a week ago Friday, I was having breakfast with my best friend who I met in grade 6, Brian, and he got a gift card for breakfast, so he said, let's go for breakfast. And he's looking at a whole bunch of volunteer opportunities, and I was talking to him about mattering. I said, but you need to find something that you're going to see that you really are making a difference in people's lives. And people say, you know, volunteering is great, but it has to be meaningful volunteering, and often they mean you're making a difference. And he said, well, I found something for me. And I said, what? And he goes, teaching language for English to people who are new to Canada. I said, exactly. That's exactly a perfect thing. You're making a direct impact on somebody's life. And he said, and also it will get all of his family members off his back about what are you going to do? You can't play tennis all day. Kathy, you can tell him I mentioned him now. I had to pay him back for something he said yesterday. Now, Schlossberg said, the polar themes of marginality and mattering connect all of us, rich and poor, young and old, male and female. Are we part of things? Do we belong? Are we central or marginal? Do we make a difference? Do others care about us and make us feel like we matter? And that says it all. And the idea it connects all of us. When I see a famous celebrity who ends up not having such a great life, invariably you can find that they didn't get a permanent sense of mattering to the people who mattered to them. Now, here's an example and something that we need to focus on. The feelings of not mattering, marginalized groups. Of course, we have the residential schools in Canada. And when you think about the Orange Day that's now coming around every year, think about mattering and not mattering, because it's orange, because the school survivor Phyllis Webstat said, to her, orange is the color of not mattering, because that's what she was wearing the day that she was taken away from her family, an orange t-shirt. And that's how Orange Day became about, is that it reflected what she was wearing. This goes back to what I was saying about if you feel like you don't matter in terms of your individual relationships, and you don't matter in terms of your societal standing because the group has been marginalized, it's a double whammy that will amplify the negative outcomes. On the other hand, having them both can change lives. Now, why should we focus on promoting mattering in youth? Well, the National Research Council in the US actually identified this as one of the keys to youth-based empowerment and youth development. And they specifically said in a document by Eccles, who's at the University of Michigan, that youth become fully engaged in their communities if they develop a sense of mattering and efficacy. That's one of 6 things that they listed in terms of keys to youth development. And it's amazing to me in psychology that nobody then picked up on that and said, look, it's right in there as a key to youth development. And especially developmental psychologists really didn't pick up on this. It's a concept that has been kept alive for many years, mostly by sociologists. Now, why should we be concerned about feelings of not mattering? This is research that was done in the York region because I was able to be on their assessment committee. Again, the power of former students, because the chief psychologist was somebody I'd worked with and said, you know, we're going to start measuring things. Maybe we should ask people who have some background. And I happened onto the mattering thing, so I said, just add this one item if you could. And basic question, I feel like I matter to other people. Over almost 24,000 students, 65%, so about 2 out of 3, say, yes, I feel like I matter to other people. But sadly, 1 in 5 said they didn't matter, point blank. One student said, not only circled it, he wrote free storm. We weren't supposed to write on this, you just answer by circling. He wrote, not only do I not matter, I'm absolutely certain of this, and 5 exclamation marks. Sadly, I don't know who that student is because that's somebody who needed some quick intervention. And another 1 in 7 said they weren't sure. So 1 out of 3 do not have a firm sense of feeling like they matter in York Region. And then you can just start to connect the dots to some of the emotional health problems and other problems that emerge. It's even worse when they're asked, do you feel like you matter in your community? One of the large surveys has one item buried in it that's supposed to tap belonging and relatedness, but it actually is worded as, do you feel like you matter in your community? In Santa Clara, 1 out of 3 about said, yes, I feel like I matter. The other 2/3 didn't. Vermont, it's 50-50, and that's what it tends to be because this has been done in about 14 different jurisdictions. And one of the few times it was asked in Canada was New Brunswick, and 47% said I matter in my community. So imagine the child or adolescent who doesn't have a sense of mattering at home, but also doesn't have a sense that they matter in their community. Where are they going to go? They're certainly not going to go for help if they've got that feeling of insignificance. Here's one that I wanted to show you from the Waterloo School Board. I had nothing to do with this. I was very pleased to find it, where they asked them about mattering at school versus belonging at school. And in terms of mattering at school, down the left side, 3 out of 5 said, yes, I matter at school. But again, 26% said, well, only sometimes, and 14%, so about 1 out of 7 said, I don't matter at school. On the other hand, belonging, 76% said they belong, 16% said sometimes, and only 8% said for sure, I don't belong. I was talking to my colleagues at one of the school boards a couple of weeks ago, and they said they're particularly interested in the students who feel like they belong in the school, but don't feel like they matter in the school, because they see all kinds of indicators that these students are actually not very well off in terms of how they're doing, both academically and emotionally. So that shows you mattering and belonging are not the same thing, because there's a group that has one but not the other. Now, in addition to the numbers, why should we be concerned? Well, feelings of mattering predict academic difficulties, depression and suicidal tendencies, physical health problems. Just checking my watch. And let me show you a bit of that now. I'll keep the part about the numbers down to a minimum. So in terms of academic costs, why educators should matter and why everyone should matter, if you feel like you don't matter, either in general or at school, there's a greater risk of dropping out, lower levels of academic performance, lower what we call academic self-efficacy, which is a sense of capability. I can do things, I can make things happen. So a lower level of that, and a lower level of school-related positive affect. So they're not going to say that school is fun or makes them happy. It's and higher levels of negative school-related affect. And clearly the student who is going to a school where they feel they don't matter is at great risk of not continuing or falling by the wayside in other ways. You see, you don't have to do much to connect the dots in terms of what this would tell universities and colleges as well in terms of where they need to focus energies. In terms of depression, the Rosenberg and McCullough paper I referred to also summarized data from 4 large US samples, humongous samples of 2,000, 3,000, 10,000, and they measured self-esteem and mattering and depression and showed that lower levels of mattering related to depression and continued to predict depression even after controlling for self-esteem. So again, that reinforces that mattering and self-esteem are related but different. And then there in a couple of the studies, Rosenberg had data that made him, allowed him to say, the low mattering adolescent is also strikingly more likely to express hostility, embitterment, and disenchantment. So there's a clear link with behavioral problems for those who act out as a result of that. And sadly, one of the theories that's gaining prominence of terrorist behavior is called the search for significance, the idea that somebody's going to do something, as we saw yesterday, sadly, where they'll say, okay, well, you didn't think I was important. I'm going to show you I'm important, even if it means that I'm not here anymore. And it's sad when it reaches that level. So next week, I'll be talking with another researcher who's a journal editor about starting to look at mattering and how to address it in gangs. So it shows you potential applications, which I'll also get to. Essentially, if you have mattering in general, but also mattering at school, you get an added benefit. And as I said, it's robust predictors. Here's a slide. I want to show you the second one, but all you need to know about this is this shows that mattering in general and mattering at school are associated with less depression, less anxiety, and so on. But in terms of positive indicators, mattering in general and mattering at school and almost 1,259 high school students is related to some of the key things that people need when they're challenged. A sense of grit, the idea that you can continue and you're going to overcome adversity, a sense of hope. And we also created a 3-part resilience measure for students. And we showed that not only is there a link between higher emotional resilience, but also greater academic resilience, which is called buoyancy by an Australian researcher, and most importantly, interpersonal resilience. Because a lot of what happens in terms of people's lives is the interpersonal, and to be able to bounce back from the adversities you have there, whether it's bullying or exclusion or whatever, is key, and having a sense of mattering at school and in general helps you withstand some of those potentially very traumatic things. Now, I want to leave a bit of time to talk about mattering in physical health. There's only like 3 studies on this so far. We hope to have the 4th, but clearly this is something that should have a key role in terms of helping someone to have a better life in terms of physical health, and also self-care. If you feel like you matter and you've internalized it, you're more likely to do the things like you should, like going to the doctor, which I said for my wife over there, to remind myself, and doing the things that you need to do to take care of yourself. But on the other hand, if you feel like you don't matter, you'll say, well, why bother? You don't see a long future for yourself. Here's a bit of recent data that we got with 302 York students, and you just pay attention to the top line there of the correlations. So mattering and anti-mattering with the items that I described to you was associated with better general health in terms of mattering and poor general health. But the other one I wanted to draw your attention to there is loneliness. Loneliness is one of the most destructive forces in terms of people's health and well-being. And in Britain, they have the minister set aside now the Department of Addressing Profound Loneliness. And loneliness turns out to be a factor that actually has been shown to be a causal factor of early mortality. This is why, there's emotional costs in that. So one of the things I believe, and it's shown anti-mattering in this and loneliness was correlated 0.67, so a very strong relationship between feelings of not mattering and loneliness. And I'm believing now that maybe some of the health consequences of loneliness are amplified because of a feeling of not mattering. So there's lots of research to be done there. And the reason to do that kind of research is shown by this great study led by Taylor, McFarland, and Carr that just came out with 1,026 adults in the US. They looked at a concept known as allostatic load, which essentially, to water it down, is a biomarker-based index that is essentially the physiological wear and tear that people have on them as they go throughout their lives. And the more stressful your life, and the less you take care of yourself, the more wear and tear you'll have, the greater the allostatic load. And it is a known predictor of mortality. Well, allostatic load typically increases with life as we deal with more things as we go through aging. The load on us continues to increase. This is one of the reasons why you see more health problems as people get older. And this study, what they showed remarkably, was that allostatic load was essentially buffered by a person's sense of mattering. That as bad as it is to have a high allostatic load, if you're somebody who developed a sense of mattering, it dampened the effects. And allostatic load was measured with things like blood pressure and cortisol and cholesterol with physiological indicators. So mattering actually had a difference in terms of the physiological indicators. And the clear implication of this is more people feel like they matter, the better their lives will be in terms of being protected from health problems. They also measured the number of chronic illnesses and showed that lower levels of mattering were associated with more chronic illness. And perhaps that's because as well that, the causal direction there, if you have an illness, you might not be able to interact in ways that could generate those mattering experiences for you. Good news is Taylor, although based in the US, is from Toronto. So much of what we're seeing in terms of mattering developments had something to do with Toronto at some point. And the first longitudinal study on mattering that was worth really reading about was his in 2001 data collected in Toronto. Now, just briefly say that mattering, of course, as you might expect, is also associated with better work outcomes, better job satisfaction, less job stress, less likelihood of quitting, leaving. I'm sure it's also associated with less, not just absenteeism, but going through the motions at work. And there's a whole separate literature that needs to be developed there. Now, is mattering ever bad for you? Well, one time that people say it's bad for you is when they're caregivers and it's too much mattering. Somebody's come to depend on them so much that it swamps the benefits. And also, mattering is not great when you've had someone and there's been a loss of the mattering, so that you can maybe not replace that or find a new way to bounce back from it. But otherwise, so far, it all seems to be positive and beneficial. Now, I love this slide. See, you've got like 5 minutes left here. Big enough you can read it yourself. When I grow up, I'd like to study people. They interest me. I'm going to go to some big university like York, gigantic York. So you can make people's lives better? You can equip them with knowledge? No, just nosy. I put this in here as a reminder myself all the time that I couldn't be doing what I'm doing, I think, without trying to study things that can be brought out to people's lives. And that's, I said, my greatest frustration is the number of things in psychology that don't get translated into people's lives. One of the reasons why I picked mattering instead of perfectionism, although there's applications of perfectionism that are going on, already with the little bit that I've done in mattering, it has resonance with other researchers and it's starting to be reflected. So key partners we've had here, the United Way of Greater Toronto, who are focused on belonging until their president, Danielle Zanotti, who's a York graduate as well. I told him about mattering in a room here on campus, and he was literally jumping out of his seat. We can wrap this around, we can talk about them both. I said, that's it. And we've had some group sessions with them. School boards locally, York Region District School Board has it as part of their mental health strategy and learning strategy. The Durham District School Board, I gave 5 workshops to them last January and February, and it's part of their mental health strategy now. And here's a recent example of an exercise I found this week at one of the schools where you say some things and then look, it actually translates into what's going on. This is one school where they had this you matter, and at the bottom they have phrases that reflect mattering, and I guess kids had to write their feelings and how they were reflected by those, and it just makes it all the more salient, and also can help spot the kid who might feel like he or she doesn't matter. York resident study was one that was led by Joe Goldberg, who was the former chair of psychology, and our daughter is his graduate student, so Allison was part of this as well. They went into the York residence, and this tells you about university student mental health. I found out of 66 residents who volunteered for the study, there was 24 who acknowledged some current or past mental illness. So over 1 in 3, and 42 without. The study itself was to try and encourage them to become more self-compassionate. The intervention really didn't work. But when comparing those who had a history of mental illness versus those who didn't, one of the indicators that jumped out was they had lower levels of mattering, significantly lower levels of mattering, and higher levels of feelings of not mattering with those measures, as well as low self-compassion, low self-esteem, and so on. And where this gets put into action is that they then went back and they had a chat with all the residents, dons, and management staff, and they reported that they have incorporated this in terms of more mentoring, more of a theme, especially for students who have come from other countries who are really feeling that they can become invisible. So there's a direct application. Also, here's my colleague, Yvonne Bohr, who's a champion, a hero, no doubt, where she's doing this CIHR $1 million study to promote resilience in kids in Nunavut. And she's been up there more times. Her air miles, I don't know, must be through the roof. Mattering's coming into this project when we talk about the youth leaders who are going to spread the results. The study itself is to address cognitive tendencies to be hard on oneself and to get a sense of hopelessness as a result of that. But mattering is one of the themes, as well as playing a game that's been developed that is designed to try and address what they see as key causes. And the mattering development is especially relevant to the youth leaders who are taking this into the community and taking on that role that's depended on. Also, this is a factor in terms of youth homelessness, and our other colleague, Steve Gates, I'll show him here, who's from the Department of Education, Order of Canada, and amazing national and international network. He gave a talk for us, and I spoke with him. We used to be associate deans together, and we'd be putting the under-the-table comments back and forth to get through some of those meetings. So I went to him and said, what about the idea of mattering? Because now what they're doing is focusing on the prevention of homelessness. So they're building this into the National Youth Homelessness Questionnaire, and then have interventions when they get that. So again, it's just fortunate to know the right people, because this thing is going to go into the strategy that they use in terms of the promotion of mattering. Because they said the best thing to do is to try and stop the homelessness before it occurs. And Michael Orr is an example of somebody who ended up feeling not mattering and was on the streets, and then it changed his life. Here's another York alumnus that I have to mention, Dr. Marnan Heisel, who was my graduate student. He's at Western, and this is where the Movember Fund comes in. He got funding with this large group we're involved with to have retirement groups for men. And built into this is the sense of belonging, the sense of mattering, the sense that your fellow people in this group are benefiting from it in interpersonal ways, combating loneliness in particular. And just to show you, make a long story short there, we ran 3 different groups. We could have run 48 million if we'd had the funding. Hopefully somebody somewhere has the kind of funding to make this happen. But at the end of it, the men, almost without exception, said they didn't want it to end because it becomes so important to them in terms of their connecting with other men going through the same thing. And just to show you York graduates, he's gone on, he's won the top prize from the American Suicide Association, really an illustrious contributor. And then to show you the broader applications of mattering, the US Suicide Prevention Strategy slogan is "You Matter." And if you look at the hashtag "You Matter," you can find all kinds of stories and initiatives that are wrapped around this. And the slogan is "You matter in good and tough times, we all matter, and if you need support, there's the line." But that's their actual slogan. And then in Canada, for Indigenous populations, we have the amazing work of the Redver brother and sister and the We Matter campaign, which again capitalizes on this. And you can find their website and explore what they've done related to this construct. And you can even find videos from famous Canadians. The Prime Minister, still the Prime Minister, has a video on there talking about this as well. So my point is, this is something where clearly, it is being put into action. So when I say that this variable resonates with people, it resonates, but it also gets put into action. And I think I would arguably say that in terms of psychology concepts, this would be my pick as the leader in terms of the potential for knowledge mobilization and implementation and making people's lives better. So this is why my mission is, to try and get much more focus on this in psychology in particular, so that we can see that these things start to abound. So I'm going to just talk, I've already talked about ways to increase mattering. Peer-to-peer mentoring is one way, volunteering, just your interactions with other people, giving them a voice, treating them with respect. But most importantly, what they've found in studies where there's been a breakup in the family where the parents in the divorce, the sheer amount of time that a father in a divorced family situation spends with his children directly relates to the children's feeling of mattering as a buffer for all the things in that, coping with that family. And there's small ways that you can do it. Somebody said to me at York, this is very impractical for thousands of students. How do you make them feel like they matter? And I say a little bit goes a long way. Just remembering a date or something important to them or acknowledging them out of a sea of students will have an enormous impact, because the student realizes that they are one of 1,000, they are one of 10,000, 50,000. It's very easy to feel like a number. So if somebody shows you care and consideration, it's transformative. So I'll leave you with a couple of slides to think about. One of the themes here is that mattering will lift you up. And indeed, at this school, it does. This is one of the mattering staircases. Students were asked to write slogans about what mattering means to them and how they matter. And then they tape them to the stairs, and that's how you start your day. You're entering a school where that theme is right there, and you cannot forget it in a way that you could ever think that you don't matter. So one theme is mattering will lift you up, and of course I have to be a bit repetitive if I haven't already. So I'll go back to this one, and you matter. Never forget, because it's very easy when things happen to lose sight of your sense of significance. You encounter 2 or 3 people in a row, treat you like, even if it's shopping, we know that there's certain department stores, we know why they're closing, because it's like you're standing there and help me. So just a few interactions, very easy to start to feel like you don't matter. And Canada, in terms of the issues that we're going to have as a result of the aging population, really needs to wrap themselves around this concept and find meaningful ways for people to continue to have a sense of mattering. Because for many people, really, it will be a matter of life or death. Well, thank you very much. You've been very attentive.